Thanks, Aishwarya. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity for Zinnov to have a very special way to start a Friday. I think a lot of things which are very close to heart come together. We're talking about products. We're talking about how tech can do some cool things and people who are passionate about that. So thank you, Zinnov and Aishwarya. What we will plan to do today is talk about a few things in general around how tech drives a lot of product and platform growth. And usually what that means is people look at it as a tech roadmap or a product roadmap or a strategic roadmap. So we'll demystify some of that. And in the process, what Rohit and I are going to share with you is our learnings, is our reflections from having done this in a lot of different cases. And one thing I can tell you upfront, what you will find in the conversation is perhaps a lot more questions to go and deliberate on than like specific answers, because the idea is really to open up our point of view on a few different things. Happy to chat around any questions that we might have towards the end, or even reach out to us separately. That's what we'll try and achieve in the conversation today. What we will be briefly touching upon is, in general, reflecting back on the last century and what's been going on there. And there are some quotes I think we are also familiar with. We'll touch upon the business imperative and the tech promise, and a leapfrog that we've made with some very moonshot technology out there. And then we're trying to delve a little into moons, machines, and microservices. Rohit will help us drive that, and then bring a little bit of a lens of if you were to product manage this as a business, as a platform or a product that you already own, what might be some of the tips and best practices to unlock business value there. And of course, like Aishwarya said, take some questions towards the end. I'm sure many of us have seen this quote often, and as I was looking back over the last decade, I think this is one of those that has left a deep impression, and also at the same time represents the state of tech and business that we are in. Back in 2011, and Mark Andreessen said software is eating the world, and I think when we look back at it from where we are now, it's much more faster than perhaps we anticipated at that time. Fast forward a little further again, come 2017, and we had Jensen Huang say something that was more on AI is eating software. So, we are seeing another leap jump there. And something which is recent, and I'm sure each of us is reading, talking so much about this, and that's not the topic for today, by the way, but it was hard for me not to look at this aspect here really. When we're saying chatbots are, I was looking for a quote, and then I realized that today, we have the potential of quotes not coming from people. So, there is some good fun going on there. Again, if we just reflect back, I think rapid change in terms of what has happened, and we're going to look at the change from a number of different lenses. What has this meant? And I again went back and looked at it from, what's been making the splash over all this past few years. Let's start with what was making news. More closer home, big shift in shopping. We all started doing retail shopping, big way in e-commerce. And the big billion-day sale, we used to hear of, all the big sales elsewhere in the world, and we had one coming to India. Flipkart launched the first one. For those of you who remember print media, the entire first page was about the sale. And they had a lot more folks who logged in for the sale than they anticipated. And of course, there were some glitches that came along the way. And in their last sale, 2022, they witnessed about 1 billion customer visits. And that's a short span of a few years. And look at the growth that they've seen there. Again, in a teasing way, Amazon and eating the world, and what Amazon has been able to do, not just in one particular product line or offering. I mean, they have a very diverse portfolio. On one side, if you see, the retail sales were going really low, and Amazon shares were going up. So it was not just interest, it was not just footprint, it was not just adoption, but they were seeing real dollar impact being positively seen in their world. And then again, and I promise this is the last ChatGPT example I'm going to use for the rest of the conversation. But really, I think the power of technology in being able to look at different use cases or different scenarios in life that we are able to impact and touch and solve with technology, being able to save a pet's life, or being able to use it in a courtroom. Again, not usual things that we would expect. Scale and all other things related to what we would call in a traditional world as a performance, or your NFRs, availability, security, resilience, in a big way also stand behind the scale revenue growth. I think different companies are making growth in a different way. Old companies have had to go and reinvent themselves. So a lot of change happening out there. And if we just look in the span of consumer and business applications, nothing better than UPI, which demonstrates how within a very short time, there has not just been consumer uptake, there has been a lot of actual, transactions, and, just look at the ticket size that's going through the whole pipeline. It's huge, and it's only set up for more growth. Again, powered by tech behind what's sitting in there. And on the B2B side, the growth looks different, but someone like Salesforce, who has been cloud native, who has a lot of different applications, the scale, and these represent in many cases very large customers and a very large set of the Fortune 500, which means that the expectations in a business world are very different. Speaking more closer at home at night, we've been in business for 30 years. We predominantly make software for the 3 different portfolios. One is on the customer experience side. We have product offerings on the finance side around anti-money laundering and fraud detection, and then on the public safety. And just speaking of the CX one, we made a very conscious shift to be cloud first, cloud native, and move from having our products from being just on-prem to as a service. And these numbers that we see is a representation of the cloud transactions or interactions and the million users that we have. So again, we've been able to see and go through this experience ourselves, turning the dial a little more, looking at what has tech or the innovation space looked like from an adoption perspective. What you see on the left, and without getting into the specifics, I think the busyness of the chart will show us. So what's that representing really is, this is a snapshot of different appliances used in United States, and it's plotted against 18th century to 2020, and we can see towards the right end it's crowded, and there are very short rapid cycles of innovations. And that's not just in the household. What we see on the right is really about things that are from a social media platform. Again, the growth is very rapid. And this is how we experience it as consumers. This is how we experience it as businesses, again, being powered by tech behind. And these are, again, just 2 samples. The capacity of compute, the capacity of what we can do in all attributes, speed, scale, is going up. And at the same time, the cost is going down. And that really gives some very powerful levers for organizations to be able to use technology in a very, very innovative way in solving these problems. These are at a high level some of the tech trends that we've seen that have shaped the last few years. None of them are new. We're all familiar with some of those. But when we look at any of the marketplaces that have become so pervasive in the last 10 years, if we look at any of the platforms like an Uber or a Netflix, or if we see just some of the examples in e-commerce, connectivity, big data, they're all part of a lot of different applications and businesses, irrespective of the vertical of the domain that an organization may be in. Just for today's purposes, we would be focusing on, how distributed architecture has played a key role in helping organizations make the shift. And the reason to call this out is, usually when we have organizations who are building products or platforms to launch to the market, there will, in many cases, or rather most cases, be you will have innovations and a strategic roadmap which are driven by the needs of the domain and the user and the business. But at the same side, if you're not able to bake in the right levers of technology or technical innovations, that remains as either an afterthought, or it's loosely coupled, or it soon starts becoming a bottleneck, or just ends up being one of the things that you've always had in the wish list, but it just does not see progress much more further ahead, and over time becomes tech debt. And that's something that we all are familiar with, but we all struggle with, and no one likes anything to get into the tech debt bucket, right? And here we'll see how we can avoid that to happen. From a innovation or disruptive innovation perspective, also if you just look at what's going on in the market right now, is this is a disruptive innovation, as many of you may be familiar. Usually you will have an old tech that you use to solve a problem, and over time the competitive edge increases and then it plateaus out, and then you start looking at new ways of creating a step change and then unlocking additional value. And in the past, this used to happen over a wider time horizon. But if we fast forward and just take an example from something that we're all deeply familiar with, let's say music. I mean, there was a time when music was consumed through cassettes, and then CDs came on very quickly. And today, any device that we have on is essentially a music player. I mean, we don't even think of music as something that's not going to be with us at all times. So even the innovation cycles are getting really, really shorter and faster. And what that means is the cycle time that we have to be able to unlock the value of tech. And again, it goes back into that circle that we see on the left. That's really where, there is an opportunity to make change. That's really the paradox of the old and the new. The focus or the need for the organizations to look at the change in paradigm to drive this faster becomes much more important. So in short, I think we have enough signs of big shift across a lot of different vectors. It does not matter which lens we apply to look at it, but it's very clear that tech is driving business. We are able to see how tech has been able to, let's say, the same Flipkart story, they had 1 billion visitors. And of course, there are a lot of numbers around the sales that they were able to do, the profits that they made for themselves, the ticket size of sales that vendors could see, of different cities, of benefits that consumers had, a lot of relevant business metrics out there. And at the same time, business is pushing tech. I'm sure in their roadmap, if it was 1 billion today, they would want that to be 2 billion or 3 billion in their subsequent ones. So at the same time, there is this interesting push and pull, and that's opening up new avenues for each of the businesses. So today, it's really tied in the hip. It's not one versus the two or one ahead of the two. It's really, needs to go hand in hand. And then a consumer or the customer is a key part of the entire conversation, and their expectations have changed significantly. And we've been talking about this for a while. They're telling, come meet me where I am. It does not matter, if I'm a business user or a consumer, make it so personalized for me, make it contextual for me. My experiences matter, micro moments matter. And what that really means is being able to do a lot of personalized things, a lot of contextual things, just at the right moment, faster, more sharper and more contextual, just in time when it matters to the consumer. And with all of this, what really also ends up happening is tech can never sleep. People just expect all of this to be available at all times. I mean, there used to be a time when you would go do shopping on a weekend or wait till 11 a.m. when the stores would open, browse around until 8 or so when the staff would start nudging you for you to, check out and ensure you've finished your payment and you collect your goods before you can head out. But most of us are shopping in the middle of the night today, and we expect the exact same level of SLAs, the exact same level of experience, the exact same level of security at all times. So tech really never gets to sleep in the world that we are on. And what that really then means is, as we manage our products, as we manage our business offerings and portfolios, it becomes important for us to see how do we ensure tech is a key part of our strategy? How do we ensure that we are able to make the right investments? Again, these will always need to be balanced between your priorities as well as cost and the impact that it can create for the business. And with that, I would really like to invite Rohit from my team. He's someone who has done this many times. He's doing it for us even right now. And he'd be able to share with you some, interesting insights and reflections that he's seen in this journey. Over to you, Rohit, and, talk to us more about Moon Machines and microservices.
Thank you, Seema. Thanks for that context. And good morning, guys. And thanks for joining the session. So I would want to start with a picture here. And any guesses who this person is? Yes, Yes, I think you're right. So this person is Neil Armstrong, the first human to land on moon. And I believe it has been one of the greatest achievements that humans have achieved in the field of technology. But also having said that, a lot of us don't know that it was a janitor, yes, a janitor who helped put the man on the moon. So the story goes like this, that it was during the Cold War when the Soviets and the Americans were against each other, and the space race, it was at the forefront of it. So it started with the Soviets launching the first satellite into space, which was Sputnik, which was then followed by Yuri Gagarin, who became the first human to go into space. Now, the effect that this had was there was tremendous pressure on the Americans. First, because they were lagging in the space race, and second, because there were theories around what if the space could be weaponized, right? So the then president, John F. Kennedy, he being a great leader and a visionary, he understood the criticality of the situation, and then he set forth a bold vision in front of the country. So he addressed the nation and he said that we choose to go to the moon. And we choose to go to the moon not because it is going to be easy, but because it is going to be hard. And it is going to serve as a measure to test our limits and capabilities. So having said that, the effect that this had was the entire nation rallied behind the cause. And then they famously say that once Kennedy was visiting a NASA Space Center and he bumped into a janitor. And upon querying, he asked, "What are you doing?" And the janitor replied, "Well, Mr. President, I'm helping you put a man on the moon." So the reason I'm telling you this story is to testify what a well-articulated, bold, and a clear mission or a vision or a why can achieve. And if you look at, maybe if you can go to the next slide, Seema. Yeah. If you look at the companies or the businesses that were pioneers in the adoption of the microservices, right? All of them, they had a very clear why to embark on this journey. So be it Netflix, be it Amazon, be it Spotify. So for example, Netflix, they faced a huge downtime in 2008, which led them to rethink the operational model, and they had to then go to microservices. Similarly, if you talk about Amazon, so Amazon kept growing bigger and bigger, and then they reached a point wherein adding new features to the production of the product, it became very complex. And it also meant that it was very risky and meant also a lot of times there were frequent outages. And then for Spotify, Spotify was operating in a very competitive market with other competitors like Apple Music, YouTube, right? And it meant that they had to be very nimble and very quick to react, and also to capture the market share very quickly. So even that led them to go to microservices, right? And I'm also saying that the other part of that is, if we can go to the next slide, the organizations that we think have to go to the microservices, the first question that they would want to ask themselves is, what is the moon for them, right? By moon, what I mean is, what is the business problem that they want to solve, right? And why do they want to solve that business problem, right? Because if we know that, then we would know that by solving that problem, how do we deliver value to the customers, and in turn, how do we grow our business and be leaders in the respective markets? And that would be the first question to ask. And the other question to ask is, why do we think that microservices is going to be the rocket that is going to lead us to the moon? So I think this would be a good point to have a quick refresh on what do we mean when we say microservices. So I would stick to a simple example of a retail application so that it becomes easier for us to understand throughout this entire session. So on the left is a retail application, which is a monolith, and which has all of the capabilities which are built into a single application, and it works on a single database. Now, when we move a particular capability out of this monolith and host it independently with its own service, API, logic, and the database, that is what we call as a microservice, right? Now, the benefits of doing microservices is that they're easier to scale, they are very agile, and the time to market is very less. They are often not a single point of failure, which is often the case in case of monoliths. And then definitely you can have a choice of tech to use whenever you build different microservices, right? But they also come at a cost, right? So when you build too many microservices, there is often a chance that the deployment model, right, it can quickly get very complex. And then there is also the other operational overhead of increased monitoring. So the more services that you spawn, the more monitoring that you have to do, which is not the case in case of monolith. And then definitely there are a lot of services which are speaking to each other over API. So there is also the communication over it. So a good point to stress over here would be that the organizations, they need to be very thoughtful about deciding if microservices is really the rocket that they think is going to take them to the moon. And the other aspect of that is the winning organizations or organizations which are successful, they are often leaders and visionaries like Kennedy, and they understand that even to ensure some marginal success in this entire journey, they have to influence the way in which people, teams, and the entire organization thinks, right? And that brings me to this book called as Drive by Daniel Pink. So this is one of my favorite books, which says that there are only three things that motivates people or teams, and that is nothing but the ability to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose over their works. And if you look at a clear why, it underlines all three of them, right? So if the why is clear, then the teams or the people are going to fine tune their actions to match the why. And in turn, you don't have to no longer control the actions of the team or the product or the organization, right? If the why is bold enough and big enough, then people are going to realize that their older selves is not going to help to reach this why, because this is now a bigger and a bolder why. And then they will have to level up to reach this new objective. And last but not the least, if the why is relatable, and it often happens that a lot of times we are on the journey, but people are not able to relate the work to the bigger goal that we are trying to achieve, right? So that is where this is a very important thing to address, that if the why is relatable, then it creates a sense of purpose, and people can relate their work that they're doing to a bigger meaningful thing that they are targeting to achieve, right? And then they don't feel like being very task oriented. So that is an important thing to consider when we go on the journey. And if if we ever think of making a roadmap to microservices, I think it would be nothing less than going to moon with its all set of unknowns. And often the first step in that journey would be knowing the why, as in why, or the what is the business problem that you would want to solve, and why do you want to solve it. And also the other part of why, as in why do you think that microservices is going to be the rocket that is going to take you to the moon, and then communicating that in a very compelling and a very clear way to the teams. So having said that, now I would move on to the next part. So one of the other highlights of the Apollo mission was the Saturn V rocket, and it continues to be one of the most biggest and the powerful rockets ever built. And if you look at it, it looks like a big monolith, right? But if you take a closer look at it, right, we see that though it looks like a monolith, but it was made up of different modules that did just one function, right? And this is quite strikingly similar to what Martin Fowler, one of the early advocates of microservices, prescribed for them. So he said the key characteristics and one of the major characteristics of microservices is that they are organized around business capabilities. So the question is, what is meant by business capabilities, right? Now, if we go to our earlier example of the retail application or and say an e-commerce company, so business capability is nothing but what an organization or a business does day in and day out to deliver value to the customers, right? And if we can just go to the next slide. It could mean anything like shopping cart, order management, billing, product catalog, payments, or invoicing, right? If you think in terms of an e-commerce company, right? And the benefit of doing this is when you decompose the monolith around business capabilities, often these business capabilities are not that change very frequently, right? So the benefit is that the resulting architecture, it is very stable. And the other interesting aspect of this is a very interesting law called as Conway's law, which says that often the teams and the software on which they are working, they tend to mimic each other, right? So the benefit again of decomposing around the business capabilities is that the resultant teams that are working on these microservices, these are no longer the teams that are identified by a particular software architect or a layer on which they are working on, but these are truly the teams that are identified by the customer problem that they're trying to solve and the business value that they're trying to deliver. And these are truly independent teams who are not dependent on the work of other teams to deliver value to the customers. And these are the teams that build truly customer-centric and products that are truly microservice in nature. So that brings me to the roadmap again that we saw earlier, right? And if there has to be a second step in this entire journey, that has to be supporting the how of the decomposition of the microservices. And I would want to highlight an important point over here. And I've seen this quite often, that a lot of business people and product people think that this is quite a technical thing, and it is often delegated to the tech teams or the architects. And but I would say a lot of work that we do in this part, and it is very crucial, and the product or the business has a very crucial role to play in here, right? So having said that, the second step, we will want to support the decomposition of the monolith by decomposing them around the business capabilities. And as a PM or a product person or business person, we would want to identify the service boundaries of the microservices, the API, the data, and then move them to the respective services that we think we have to build. Okay, so that was the second step in our journey. Now moving on, there is this important thing that I have noticed in my experience on building microservices in different organizations, also nice, that one of the biggest and most common problems that we face in this entire journey is that we tend to have too much confidence in our plans. And it is often seen that it usually takes longer than we anticipate to complete this entire journey from monolith to microservices. And why does that happen? And it usually happens because of one of the most common cognitive biases, which is nothing but planning fallacy. So what happens in planning fallacy is we tend to overestimate our capabilities, and we have a very optimistic vision of the future. And also often in microservices, we don't have a complete understanding or knowledge about what are the kind of challenges that we might face when we go on this journey, right? Which means, like I said, it would often take you longer than you anticipate to complete this entire journey. And if we go on to the next slide, I compiled few stats from a few products that I worked on, wherein we moved to microservices so that it is easier for you to understand. And if you look at this, these are the major obstacles that we faced when we moved to microservices. And surprisingly, a lot of them we never anticipated. And I would maybe speak about briefly about a few of the top challenges that we faced. And if you look at this, planning still continues to be the top challenge that we faced. And then definitely the deployment. So like I spoke earlier, as in when you make more microservices, they have to be independently managed and deployed, right? That increases the complexity of the deployment. And then the other most biggest thing that I thought was an obstacle in this journey was the new tech understanding. So when we build microservices, right, we think of it as an opportunity to move to a new tech. And often we would think of moving our existing products to a new technology. And so that is often the biggest obstacle that we face. And we tend to assume that tech comes very naturally to the tech teams, which I would say no, it is not often the case. And then there is often a learning curve that we would want to have for the teams to get comfortable to learn this new technique. And then definitely when we build more and more services, often it is difficult to maintain the same quality of code across all of these microservices, right? So these were the top challenges that we faced. And when we know that it is going to take us so long to complete this journey, it becomes even more important to understand that we have to break this entire journey into smaller parts and target one microservice at a time. And I have just put in on the stat. So because of these delays, we had to push our milestones a lot of times ahead, and which justifies the point that it always takes longer than we anticipate. So the question comes, how do we prioritize, or what is the first microservice that we should choose, right? And I would say if the clock is not ticking for you, and if often there is not a burning problem to address, then you should start with that microservice, which is more easier to build. and that would give the teams some learning curve, right, to get comfortable in building microservices. And once they're comfortable building a particular simple microservice, then they can pick a complex piece of code from the monolith that then can be moved to the microservices. So that is one way to go ahead about it. The other approach would be if it is something, if it is something, a critical business problem that you would want to address, then you should start with that microservice that would deliver the maximum business value. So for an example, if it is an e-commerce company which sees a huge surge in the traffic or users when it goes on, say, some holiday season sale, then I would ideally target the search microservice first, right? Because that is the one that deteriorates the most often. And if it is an apparel company wherein the stock quickly goes out of stock, then I would maybe target the catalog or the inventory microservice first. So moving on to our the journey. So if we have to prioritize one microservice at a time, it is important for us to decide which microservice, when targeted first, would we deliver us the maximum business value in this entire journey. So that brings me to the last part of my session. And I started with a story from Apollo mission, and I would like to end with a story from an Apollo mission. Having said that, I'm quite fascinated with this entire story. So this is a very interesting story. So it happened during the final stages of the landing, and the lunar module that was being piloted down the moon surface, it began reporting errors just 7.5 minutes before the landing. And the error code was 1202. And trust me, it was a complete havoc and a panic situation because none of the astronauts, they had encountered this error in any of the trial runs that they'd done in the simulator, right? And they were even contemplating of aborting the mission because they were quickly running out of the fuel. So it was quite a critical situation. And then they urgently requested a reading on this error from the ground team. And the ground team, upon checking, they found that this error was due to a memory overload error on the guidance computer. And that was not so critical as we assumed it to be, right? And it was figured out that the error would go on its own once the computer reboots, and it would not entirely jeopardize the landing, right? So the team was given a go-ahead on the landing, but this was only after a lot of a crucial time was lost and there was a lot of panic situation, right? And the point that I'm trying to make over here is we often tend to lose focus and tend to lose a lot of crucial time when we focus on the not so right metrics or too many metrics, right? So the question is, what would be a right metric to track when we move to microservices? So my experience says that it has to be a combination of both a product and a business metric. So for an example, if we think again of that e-commerce company or a retail application, so a leading metric, what I would want to target is concurrent users, because that is more easier to track on real time and easier to impact. And I would often say that you choose one metric and one simple metric, because the benefit of that is easier for the teams to understand. And the more frequently you track that, the more teams understand how important this metric is, and then they focus all their efforts to improve this metric. Having said that, it is also important to quantify the ROI of building this microservice, or the impact of the building this microservice on the business rate. That is where the lagging indicators or the metrics come into picture. So I would say there are a few lagging metrics that you should also target. So for example, it could be the cost of building a microservice, and eventually what would be the ARPU or the revenue that it would drive from this service when put into production. The kind of churn it would reduce. So it is often seen, for example, in B2B businesses, right? The more, as in when we scale the software, the more bigger customers that you onboard, these are usually the customers that take longer the time, right? So it also works in our favor because it also takes longer time for them to churn, right? So that in turn ensures that the churn is lesser when we onboard the larger customers and we scale the system. And then eventually the revenue or the bottom line of the company, how you impact it, right? So though you might impact it directly or indirectly, but it is often a good
thing to know, right? That where are your efforts impacting the overall business or the profitability of the company, and how do you help the company to grow the business, right? So that I think should be a combination of both a leading and lagging metric, and that should be the first step in our entire roadmap to the microservices, is to understand what would be the right metric to measure or track to ensure that we stay on the path to success. So that was the entire journey that I showed you or walked you through for the journey of the microservices. So a quick recap before I hand over the session to Seema. So we start with the why. We know the business problem or the vision of the company. We communicate that in a very compelling way to the teams. We support the how of the decomposition of the microservices. We decide which is the microservice when targeted first would deliver us the maximum business value. And last but not the least, we measure which metrics, or we decide which metrics when targeted would make sure that we stay on the path. Right. So having said that, I would now want to leave you with this visuals, which show what did success mean like to the entire Apollo crew. And this was the final moon landing on the moon. And though Kennedy did not live to see this happen, but his vision and his speech, it stayed with the people. And they made sure that they made America the winner in the space race. And I hope a lot of learning that I shared today would help you to win in this journey to microservices. Thank you, guys. I would now hand over to you.
Thanks, Rohit. And with that, really, if we do a quick recap, right, of all the ingredients that you might need to, propel the fuel for your microservices rocket launch. And I personally, love the story that Rohit uses and the analogy that he has. I think it really pushes us to think more. It really pushes us to justify hard. It really, ensures that we have the right reasons for what we do. And in that context, really, there needs to be a big moon. There needs to be a very big, bold why on why, any organization, product wants to go down this journey. And then find the right tool or the machine. Here it's microservices, but really, if you take a step back and look at it, most tech enablers, most, step change technologies, if you go back to the S-curve that we were talking, they have potential to be tapped, but till you've tapped it, it's still potential. And how do you realize that? Which is why the why becomes important. And then really taking an approach where, there are going to be unknowns, it's going to be iterative, but you do know your destination, and you take, a very informed approach, a strategic business first approach to prioritizing that particular part of your proposition or capability or feature set that you want to take and experiment with. Because to be honest, you are going to start with experimentation, and for all you know, some of those may not take off, or it may not take off for the services that we identified, or for the particular business areas that or capabilities that we thought we might want to positively influence any of that with. And having done that and started with that, planning small, building, measuring, iterating, again, nothing new, but I think the rigor that you would usually apply for the rest of your product roadmap and your product backlog, it helps, or rather it's important that we apply the exact same rigor, even if it's going to be, a tech-enabled feature set first, because eventually what we are going to build with that is a capability that maybe people don't see, but they are going to experience it. And if we recollect from the big shifts, experience is a big thing that people touch, feel every single day. It does not matter if it's a consumer, if it does not matter if it's a user in a business application or a business software. And that's where a lot of that becomes important. And the other part of the puzzle really is, how do you ensure you have the right set of organization, right set of teams? How do you bring the right alignment? And these are cross-functional, right? It's not, like Rohit said, just the PM or the architect or your dev lead or your engineering leader or the product leader. Or now in the world of microservices, in many cases, it's actually going to also mean that you're on the cloud and you have operations or DevOps. I mean, something that we happily left for a customer to manage in a monolith in many cases. Now that's something that you also need to take on, which means you're looking at teams even beyond the usual set that need to understand this vision, that need to understand the plan, and that need to be aligned. So highly aligned, loosely coupled teams is really a great way to look at this, so that at all times, irrespective of the role, irrespective of the tasks ahead of us, they all know the larger goal and how they can work closely together in a cross-functional way to bring that to life. And lastly, I mean, while and which is why we like the the moon and the machine example. Eventually, there is a tech today, or there will be a tech tomorrow. I mean, today we are looking to solve some of this through microservices. I mean, I can promise, fast forward 3-4 years, 5 years, there is going to be something much more sophisticated than this, which might need us to rethink the entire approach of solving it. But at the end of the day, we may still be solving the same things. And if we look at the example that Rohit was using, if it's going to be, hey, I need to be able to shop cheaper, faster, it is still going to be, that capability where we used to do that in a store and now we're doing it in a website. Tomorrow it's going to be someplace else, and there is going to be a different technology. So besides technology, besides what it means for the business now, it also means that we bring the right level of changes to levers around mindset, culture, and talent, because that's really where when we have new things that are coming on, when there are occasions when the fallacies that he was talking about, it takes longer, it takes more iterations, there are surprises that come along the way, 1 to 0 2 happens. You really need to be able to have the right mindset and culture to be able to really look at that. That cannot be an afterthought while you want to approach this strategically. Again, not a whole lot of different things. This is really how you would manage most of the product, most of your portfolio that you have. But being intentional of applying the exact same principles and the exact same rigor, even to something like a microservices, which feels like it's a technology item, it's technology roadmap, it's tech debt or any of that. And this is vocabulary usually where, if you look at your buckets in any of the organizations, that's where some of this tends to be, right? So I think as product people, as engineers, as leaders, irrespective of where we are and what our roles are, I think it helps to be able to look at this conversation from a more holistic lens and really encourage a collaboration and the challenge from the lens of looking at it as a strategic investment. So we hope that you were able to, take a lot more things to deliberate upon. You were able to look at a lot more, aspects to go and see in how you're approaching it, how you're scaling it. If you have any comments or learnings where you thought you've been able to do something that has worked for you over and beyond this, we'd be happy to learn about it. Drop us a note, reach out on LinkedIn. We'd be happy to learn too. I mean, this is equally as much about the same thing. But we truly do, wish and hope that, each of you is able to find your moon, or if you've already found your moon, you're able to launch your microservices rocket and kind of, get there. I like the astronaut, it's like, let's go get it. So wishing everyone a very successful microservices journey ahead. I share with that, I think we kind of come to the end of what we wanted to cover as a presentation, but we'd be happy to, take on any questions and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Seema and Rohit. I think we had a wonderful session, and we do have quite a bit of questions where we want to pick your brains on. I think we'll get started with that, considering the time that we have in hand, right? I think most of the questions that they've asked are, you have covered the bits and pieces of it through your slides, but we'd want to probably deep dive on a few of them, right? Let's start with the question in terms of what are the best practices for implementing microservices in an organization based on your experience, right?
I would maybe answer to that more from the business perspective. I would not go too much into the architecture, right? So often I would want to say that it is not just a technical problem that we are addressing, right? It is also an organizational shift, right? So we need to make sure that when we are thinking of teams that want to build microservices, these are cross-functional teams, right? Like if you remember the challenges that I spoke of. So there was a lot of dependency on the DevOps teams, right? And often when we start with microservices, we realize that a lot of team does not understand how DevOps works, right? And there is going to be a lot of deployment that we would want to do. And this in turn means that it takes a lot of more time for us to understand how to build microservices, right? And that in turn, like I said earlier, is going to take longer than I expect. So I would say, don't approach this just from a technical standpoint, but also an organizational change. It would require a lot of upskilling to be done, a lot of change in the thought leadership, right? a lot of change in how leaders think about it. And I think that should handle most aspect of the, how do we go about that?
And I could
As you touch base,
one aspect, Aishwarya, also, for from a planning or an alignment perspective, I think it's very important to ensure you're able to bring in the view top down, and which is why the why, and that's where sometimes I think teams struggle with it, because being able to articulate the why becomes hard, because you're starting with tech first, but that's a good place to deliberate.
As we touch base upon a little bit of the challenges, right? How can you think that the organization can ensure that microservices are properly integrated with the existing systems and applications?
So maybe I will speak more from what I experienced. So you always make sure that you leave enough supply lines open. I will take an example. So this is a very kind of strategy that has been followed in wars, right? Whenever you go into new territories, you keep the supply lines open, right? And what I mean by that is, whenever you move to microservices, you ensure that there is a lot of feature toggles that you keep, so that you ensure that if anything goes wrong, you can quickly go back to the BAU or the business as usual, right? So that is one business practice that I can think of. The other thing that I can think of is build small, build quicker until you get confident. And then as and when you get more confident, then you pick up more complex pieces. And then definitely the other thing is when we talk of microservices, right, we often talk of speed, scalability, right? But a lot of times we don't talk about quality, right? And that is also an important aspect that we have to stress, that it just does not have to be a scale or speed. We just also have to make sure that also the quality part of that is going to be addressed, because eventually customers are not like to have a product which scales but is not going to meet the quality that they are expecting, right? So that is another aspect that I think we should target.
Got it. So we talked about the cost saving that comes as a part of the microservices, right? What do you think are the other benefits that organization may realize through the adoption of the microservices?
Yeah, no, I can certainly, speak to it a little bit, and I'll go back to some of the things that we saw in the first part of the discussion. Cost perhaps I would think is a secondary benefit. It's great to have less cost, but really it allows you to get a step change. If you're able to, let's say, scale up to, and I'm just taking a rough, let's say 10,000 users today for any application that you see is your current demand. If you really want to do 10x, if you really want to do 100x, and those were the bold statements that the Spotifys and the Netflixes put, because they already had things that there was a need, there were products, and there were means to be able to do it, but it was insufficient to meet the needs. And without solving for it, it was causing two challenges. One, it was leading to a lot of stress and failure and breaking down of things, which again is not a good state for any business to be in, both from a business perspective as well as for your consumers. And on the other side, that you're looking for more growth, and your engine today, or if you're going to be taking a cycle, your cycle is not going to take you from Pune to Mumbai. You can go from maybe, point A to point B, or from this tower to that tower. The moment you change your destination, you need to change. I think that's where some of these, measured bets, and it will start with the bet, and some of those will not fire. Let's be very practical, right? It does not mean that because there is so much tech out there, it's very hard to say which tech is really going to work for you. And that's the reason why we look at some of the tips that Rohit was making, again depending on what's important for business at that point in time. If you have a burning problem, and if you see that, hey, this is where it's really burning and I need it fixing now, then you pick that part of your use case, for lack of a better word. You put enough safety net and you go attack that with your choice of technology 1 and 2. But let's say if you have some latitude, and that this, I have some latitude in my systems today for the demand that I have, that I can experiment with a few things. You'll start small. Maybe you'll actually spawn 3 teams who are experimenting with very different tech. That's a very reasonable way to look at that too.
Got it. Thank you, Seema, for that. There's also a few things that we talk about when we are adopting the microservices, right? In terms of how do you think an organization can measure the success of implementing microservices architecture, right? Are there any metrics associated with it based on your experience?
I would think it'll go back to, the why and the metric you started off in the first place. And the example that Rohit was giving, let's say, if it's search and search is your, bottleneck today, or you're expecting that to be better because that's really the first place, all your consumers in an e-commerce site are coming in. You want to ensure that's improving. And if that improves, and I'll cover this in two ways. That's going to be a primary metric. You want to be able to support more customers, right? And at the same time, what you also want to ensure is you don't want to regress on the experience. And when you go from tech A to tech B, and maybe monolith to microservices, on-prem to SaaS, usually what happens is everything else that someone else was taken care of, right? What is the responsiveness that is there? How fast is it? Does it fail? Is it safe? Now, none of this is actually defined under, I want to grow 10x more from a concurrent user scale perspective. You're taking scale as a goal for your microservices, but that's not to say that everything else that mattered is not important. You still want to ensure you're either at the same level or in fact, even better. I think that's the second set of, metrics you will always have. What are the other things that matter that we need to continue to, keep a tab on? And then really being able to see what is this going to impact or move the needle for me on the business perspective, right? I mean, if this is what is causing my users to churn, the churn is going to stop, and you will see evidence of the churn stopping, or any of that. I think that's really, how you will be able to see that the needle is moving and you're able to see some impact. And it will go up and down, like we saw, right? We may think when we plot it that it goes in a certain way, but for all we know, it may go up and down, but you will be able to make some informed choices there.
Got it. So let's assume an organization has already installed the microservices architecture, right? How can they ensure that the architecture is scalable and resilient for the years to come in?
I think, so when you build microservices, right? So often what I have followed is you don't design for a near future. So for an example, a product that I was scaling, so we started with a model wherein we forecasted for next 10 years. So we made sure that whatever we are building is scalable enough to account for the traffic that we are expecting. So that is often again a business metric that would come for the product, right? That they would give you the input that what is the kind of traffic, what is the kind of market that you see, right? And then accordingly, you take that input and then you set the KPIs for the microservices, as in what number of concurrent users you want to scale, daily average users and monthly average users, right? So I think that should be the approach that we should be taking.
So I think in the last slide, you talked about the organization changes or the cultural changes that comes along with the microservices, right? So as an organization, how do you think they should be ready for the culture in the organization that might arises or necessary for the adoption of microservices based on experience?
I can start maybe, Rohit, and feel free to add. And I think some of this really starts from, and I'll latch on to the last thing that Rohit closed with, right? I mean, he and his team really look at a 10-year horizon, and that's really their moon, right? I mean, for lack of a better word, there is a microservice one, and for microservice one, the moon is whatever that moon looks like from 10 years. Let's say if it's users, right? I mean, maybe it's 50x more users, 10x more users, whatever that milestone is for you. Now, once your product team has figured that out, it's important for you to be able to cascade that to the rest of the organization so they're able to relate to that. That's one place to start. Usually what you might see is this is the path you'll take when you're doing a product first approach to microservices. But that may or may not always be the case. In some other cases, it may come as strategic roadmap, technology roadmap, GTM roadmap, etc., and the different ways on how a lot of things might get practiced. And if you're treating it as a technology roadmap, of course, it's a tech enabler, and you are going to approach it that way. But the downside sometimes that happens, or if it's a tech debt, usually you're not able to articulate the benefit, perceived benefit, or currently what's the pain that it's causing. You could be solving for a problem, or you could be tapping into an opportunity. And that tends to be, one of the areas where in an organization, everyone knows this needs to be done, but it's just very hard to rally around the right amount of alignment and support, even at a executive level or at, let's say at a planning level, right? That's where it becomes. And then there will always be things that are much more important or which are, well understood in an organization. They'll take precedence. Now, whether or not it's right or not is a question to be debated, but that's a symptom that can occur. The next set of things is, let's say, you reach that alignment. through whichever ways, it may be through a product first approach, or you work with your teams and you're able to create that clarity. You then cascade it to the rest of the organizations. Now, in the previous world, and if you recollect the slide that Rohit was talking about, how teams might be organized, usually it will be based on, the part of the tech that they are building. Of course, a lot of that has also changed with some of the other development principles like agile and being more feature centric. But here you need to be a little more intentional, because this is a service, and a service by itself that you need to treat as a business application if I stretch it too much. But that's really the ownership that you want this feature team to take. And this feature team that we've had, we're still only building capability, right? Go build a login window, go add that Zoom button there, or create this dashboard. But here we are saying, hey, look at this entire piece, ensure we understand what the logic is going to be, ensure it has the right level of responsiveness, it has the right level of scale, it has the right level of security, and it works with everything else and the toggles and all of that. So it's like a mini application in itself. Now, the moment you get to that, it gets messy, to be honest. It's not easy, because as everyone is doing it, people are nodding their heads and they're not really aligned. So I think being intentional about putting the right teams, adding members that may not have been in the conversation up until so far, like your friends in DevOps, or even legal interest in security. I would even go that far, because security cannot be an afterthought. You cannot be ensuring that whatever trust means is going to come much later, because in most cases these are going to be highly scalable online applications. And then the culture really, it is going to be iterative, it is going to take longer, there are going to be unknowns. Are we building that psychological safety for our teams to be able to really go create that? If we don't, and if we're going to go back to our same set of old measures, or of our old set of how we run this, I think it's kind of going to hinder what we can do with the opportunity ahead of us.
Seema, as we were touching base upon the psychological safety of it, right? There's the other side of the coin where we talk about the security compliance that comes when we build a microservices architecture, right? How can the organization ensure that the microservice architecture that they're building is secure and compliant with the industry regulation that we have in place, right? What do you think the right steps that they have to take it in the right direction for that?
I think speaking about regulations, so definitely, again, that is an important point. And not only regulations, I would say there are also some things like, for example, API. So when we talk about microservices, right, it is an important thing to realize that microservices in itself is not going to help. And it has to be supported by a few other things, like, for example, API, even cloud, multi-cloud, then, for example, security. And to answer your question, when we think of regulations around security, or say even GDPR, right? So that is a key input, again, that we need to feed in when we design these microservices, right? That our data is being maintained in secure storages. We are following the regulations of the specific countries wherein we are deploying this code, right? So again, that is something, a key aspect that the business needs to look into and provide the teams that as an input, so that they can consider this while designing it. And another important point, like I said, is API, right? So I would want to stress that often we are not so used to managing the API lifecycle, right? And one of the most burning problems that I have seen, and a lot of my other counterparts also face this, is when we build microservices, we end up making a lot of APIs. And though we have a deprecation lifecycle, right, like around, we say some company might adopt an 18 months, say 1 year deprecation lifecycle, but usually that is not very strictly followed. And we end up with a lot of APIs, which are, or multiple versions of API, right? And then if we think of that one fine day, we will address all of this at once, it never happens. So an effective way would be to think of all these surrounding areas, right, like security, API, or all of the other things, right from the first point wherein you go on the journey, right, along with the microservices.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, and I often encourage and sometimes even challenge my team, and I'll be very honest about it, right? There will always be a key problem to be solved that a product exists for. It may be e-commerce or shopping. Even e-commerce is just a means, right? Helping people find the clothes that they love at the cheapest cost or in the easiest way. That's really the one-line lay problem that tools are solving out there, right? In the past, it was a store. It could have been something else. Today, you're able to we could do it on websites and we can do it on mobile. I'm sure tomorrow is going to be some other way that's going to change. So there will always be a way to deliver that. And as product people, we really have to be the custodians of what the customer wants to do in the first place. You really, don't get too caught. There will always be something which is legacy, and there is always something which is the blue-eyed tech. It does not matter. Every 3 years, it's going to flip. And sometimes we get very passionately attached to the tech part of it, which is the machine. I mean, be anchored to your moon. I think it's very important to do that. And by that, what it also means is being cognizant that the tools that we have as we're building that, we bring it back to how we do business or how we build stuff, right? And if I were just to use that same example that Rohit was talking about, and it's important, and that's what happens in the real world so much, is let's say when you're doing your planning or your roadmap, you're able to look at what's important for business. It may be coming from analysts, it may be coming as a new demand, it may be coming from a tech potential, and then you go into your backlog or release or planning and so on through the entire life cycle. Ensure you have the right gate checks for every single thing. You need to manage a microservice or an API just exactly the same way that you would manage another capability or another product feature. It cannot be an afterthought, and I think which is where that whole process, culture, team part becomes extremely important too.
So we are seeing it every day, right? There's emerging trends and technology happening almost on an everyday basis, which is changing the game in the way we work itself. I'm assuming that also the emerging trends and technologies related to microservices will also be something that we will look forward to, right? How do you think it will affect the future development?
This, I think, is the hardest question, to be honest, because it's very hard to predict. But I will go back to, I think if you have your first principle thinking in place, because there will always be a tech. You're right, Aishwarya. I mean, there is something today and there is going to be something tomorrow. And which is why it helps for you to see, what does the 10-year leap look like? And that 10-year leap is basis what you know of today. And things are changing significantly, right? I mean, that's why when I was reflecting on this, really, when we started to, bring our reflections together, I was like, software is eating the world was really what it was, but it didn't take a lot of time for that to change, for AI to be eating software. And we all know where ChatGPT is today. And 2 days back, we suddenly have leaders saying, "Hey, pause, we need time to think." So it's going to be hard. I think we're all just in the same boat like everyone else. But when a technology gets to the point where you want to consider it, using some of these principles will certainly make it, increases the probability of you approaching it in a way that is more aligned to business. But we have to be ready for very different ways of planning.
Seema, we are kind of losing you a little bit.
Yeah, and I would also want to add to what Seema said. But speaking of how technology is helping us, right? I would say, now it is microservices, maybe 10 or 15 years after this, maybe it would be something else, right? And technology, it is a very powerful enabler, right? And we see that, the technology, it is now bringing us more closer to the customers. If you look at the slide, what I presented, right? More empowered teams. So now I see that because of these microservices and all of the new tech, right? A lot of times our tech teams, they are now brought very closer to the customers. And that means that in terms of business, we understand the customer's problem well, and we are able to address that more effectively, and which is going to help us deliver better value to the customer. So definitely a lot of this might change, but a lot of this might also improve the way in which we deliver value to the customers.
Thank you, Seema and Rohit, for that. Probably one final question. I think you touched base upon it quite a bit as well. But let's, as an organization, they're just kickstarting on the microservices journey, right? What are the top 3 things that they have to be cognizant about, right?
I would say the first thing is they famously say that if you can't build a monolith, right, you cannot build a microservice. So you have to reassess, as in if monolith is still able to achieve what you want to target, right? Like for example, Adobe, right? Adobe is a big company with a lot of very good software, right? And it still continues to be on monolith, right? So I think that should be the first point to start, to introspect and look at the monolith with a very complete view, right? And then to decide if there is something that really needs to be addressed and if something that is really broken, right? So that is the first thing to start off with. When we say we move to microservices, then often the other part would be, like I said, to choose the biggest problem that we would want to address. And it cannot be everything. You would want to target scale, availability. There is always a trade-off, right? When you target for scale, often at times it might happen that availability would be impacted, right? And similarly, the other things. So the organizations need to understand what is the biggest thing that they would want to impact with microservices, and then design the journey accordingly.
Seema, is there anything else that you would like to add from your end?
I think it is some of these principles. I mean, you will need to be intentional, you will need to be iterative, and you will need to make trade-offs. And maybe just one closing thing on what Rohit said. In your experimentation journey, you may first start with scale, and you may be okay while you're experimenting still to be a little low on some of the other thresholds. And that's fine while you're in that process. And like you said, you will release it to production or to market in a phased manner. And as you release it, you will, of course, then be holistically looking at, hey, I'm not regressing on any of it. Or so there is room for you to, take all your key metrics or your key attributes and launch it to market. But not everything needs to pile up on day one, which makes it feel very overwhelming. So really, being very intentional in how you iterate and add becomes a very key part of the journey.
Thank you so much, Seema and Rohit. That's it we have for you today. It was an extremely thought-provoking session, and we had quite a bit of takeaways. Once again, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to host you both. And to the ones who joined us today, hope you found today's session insightful. Thank you once again. See you in our next Zinnov webinar. Take care and stay safe and have a great weekend ahead. Thanks a lot, everyone.